He stood there laughing, glass of champagne in hand, the city lights dancing behind him. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, smirking as if the universe had confirmed his superiority. His wife joined him, adjusting her diamond bracelet. "Oh, you're back from that overseas job?" "Must have been." "Rough," I smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when you're happy, but the kind that hides 10 years of storms. I looked around the penthouse. The marble floors, the panoramic skyline view, the gold-trimmed bar. Everything screamed luxury. Everything he believed belonged to him. Little did he know, I had been here before. In fact, I'd signed the final ownership papers in this very living room, long before he even knew this address existed. But I didn't say a word. Not yet, because sometimes silence is louder than any victory speech. He called the waiter over, as if to remind everyone who belonged in this circle. "Get my cousin here something cheap," he said jokingly. "He's new to high society." Laughter followed. Familiar laughter. The kind that once broke me. I looked out the glass wall, the city glittering below like a million unfulfilled promises. Funny thing about life, it never forgets what you've endured. It just waits for the right moment to pay it back. And tonight? That moment had arrived. But before we talk about how I ended up owning the very penthouse he bragged about, let's rewind. Let's go back to the days when my shoes had holes, when I left home with a suitcase full of hope and a heart full of shame. Let's go back to the beginning, before the success, before the betrayal, before they learned what quiet determination can build, because every empire starts with a heartbreak, and every comeback begins when people stop believing in you. So if you've ever been laughed at for trying, or mocked for failing, this story is for you. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Drop your city name in the comments below. Let's see how far our story travels. I wasn't born into privilege. Our family lived in a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet Midwestern town, a place where dreams rarely outgrew their zip code. My cousin Ethan and I were raised almost like brothers, but even as kids, our worlds were divided. His father ran a successful construction business. Mine worked night shifts at a factory that smelled like metal and broken promises. While Ethan wore brand-name sneakers to school, mine were hand-me-downs from a thrift store that smelled of mothballs. He used to tease me, not cruelly at first, just playful jabs about how I'd never fit in with his crowd. I laughed it off back then. But deep down, I promised myself one thing. One day, I'd be the one they'd have to look up to. My mother was the quiet force that held everything together. A nurse who worked double shifts, she still managed to tuck me in every night with the same advice. Work hard, stay kind, and never measure yourself by what others own. I tried to live by that. I studied like my life depended on it, because in many ways it did. I got into a decent college on partial scholarship, business administration, with dreams of building something real. Something mine, but dreams don't always survive reality. In my second year, Dad got injured at work. No compensation, no support, just layoffs and hospital bills that stacked like bricks on our kitchen table. I dropped out to help. I told myself it was temporary. A few months, maybe a year. But months became years, and reality hardened like concrete. I worked odd jobs, warehouse loader by day, delivery driver by night. Sometimes I'd fall asleep in the truck between shifts. My hands bled from the work, but my pride hurt worse. And yet I didn't complain. Because every dollar I sent home kept our lights on, Ethan. He'd already joined his father's company by then. His social media was full of vacations, suits, and smiles. At family gatherings, he'd pat my back and say, "Man, you should really think about getting serious with your life." Serious. As if struggling wasn't serious enough. Then came the biggest blow. Mom was diagnosed with a heart condition, the kind that didn't wait for miracles or insurance approvals. I sold my car, pawned my laptop, and borrowed money just to get her treated. When that wasn't enough, I made the hardest decision of my life. I left the country. A friend told me about a construction company hiring overseas. Long hours, dangerous sites, but decent pay. So I packed one suitcase, kissed my mother's forehead, and promised I'd come back stronger. She smiled, even as her eyes filled with worry. "Don't lose yourself chasing survival," she said softly. But survival had already taken everything else. The first year abroad was brutal. I slept in labor camps with 12 men in a single room. The air smelled of sweat and dust. Meals were rationed, days were endless, and pay was barely enough to send home. But I learned. I learned discipline. I learned patience. I learned that humiliation can either crush you or carve you into something unbreakable. There were days I questioned everything. I'd see my cousin's photos online, his champagne nights, his sports cars, and I'd wonder if all my struggle even mattered. But each time doubt crept in, I'd open the photo of my mother taped to the wall above my bed. Her tired smile reminded me why I was doing this. Then, slowly, things shifted. I started taking evening classes online, studying property investment and construction management. I figured if I couldn't escape the dust, I might as well learn how to build something from it. Every spare dollar went into savings, every night into study. By my 5th year, I'd moved up to site supervisor. By my 7th, I was managing small projects on my own. And then came an opportunity. A business partner offered me a chance to co-invest in real estate development back in the U.S. A small property at first, then another. I took every risk I could afford. I lived cheap, saved big, and built quietly while everyone else chased noise. Meanwhile, Ethan's father passed away, leaving him the family business. He became exactly who everyone expected him to be, successful, polished, arrogant. But beneath the suits and the spotlight, he'd inherited more pride than wisdom. I heard through the grapevine that his company was sinking under debt masked by showmanship. While he flaunted borrowed wealth, I quietly signed contracts, managed developments, and learned the art of patience. Years later, when I finally returned home, I wasn't the same boy who'd left with a suitcase. I came back with scars on my hands, experience in my mind, and ownership papers in my briefcase. The first property I bought on U.S. soil was, ironically, the very building my cousin lived in. The Penthouse, to be exact. I didn't buy it for revenge. I bought it because it symbolized everything they said I couldn't have. And when I stood there years later, watching him mock me in the same room that legally belonged to me, I realized something. Life has a sense of humor. It just takes its time delivering the punchline. The turning point in my life didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came with a phone call I almost ignored. I was finishing another 12-hour shift at the construction site in Doha, covered in dust, my boots heavy with exhaustion. My phone buzzed. A call from a man named Carlos Mendoza, a project manager I'd met years earlier on a work site in Dubai. He was one of the few who'd ever seen potential in me beyond my hard hat. "Hey, Mason," he said, his Spanish accent cutting through the static. "Remember that real estate idea we talked about? I've got something for you." I was half asleep, but his words snapped me awake. Carlos explained there was a foreclosed property project in Texas, unfinished, undervalued, but in a prime location. The bank was desperate to offload it. The problem? They needed someone with cash flow and ground experience to manage reconstruction. Most investors wanted quick returns, not long-term rebuilding. I had neither wealth nor reputation, but I had savings. Real savings. Years of hard work and sacrifice stacked into one silent opportunity. It was a risk that could either elevate me or erase me completely. I didn't hesitate. Within a week, I wired every penny I had and flew to Texas to meet him. The site was a mess, rusted scaffolding, half-poured concrete, paperwork tangled in lawsuits. Investors had walked away, banks had given up. But I didn't see chaos. I saw potential. Carlos looked at me half doubtful. "You sure you can handle this alone, amigo?" I smiled. "I've handled worse with less," and that's how it began. The next 2 years became a blur of grit and risk. I negotiated with suppliers, dealt with corrupt inspectors, and lived out of a trailer on the site just to save money. Some nights, I'd sit on a folding chair, staring at blueprints by flashlight, wondering if I'd lost my mind. The banks didn't trust me. The contractors undercut me. The locals called me the foreign guy with the crazy dream. But slowly, things started to take shape. Each wall that went up felt like redemption rising from concrete, until one day everything almost fell apart. One of my subcontractors, a man named Greg, was caught inflating invoices. He was taking kickbacks from suppliers and charging me double. When I confronted him, he laughed. "Come on, man, everyone does it. You think you'll survive in this business without playing dirty?" I fired him on the spot. But the damage was done. Half the funds were gone, timelines were broken, and the bank threatened foreclosure again. That night, I sat in my trailer staring at the contract papers with my name on them. Years of effort, all slipping through my fingers. For a moment, I wanted to give up. But then I remembered my mother's voice. Work hard, stay kind. Never measure yourself by what others own, so I didn't quit. I sold my truck, cut down to 1 meal a day, and worked through the nights myself. I took small private loans from friends abroad, even bartered with suppliers for deferred payments. Slowly, painfully, the project came back to life. And then, ironically, it was Ethan who re-entered my life. He called out of the blue, his voice syrupy with false warmth. "Hey, cousin, heard you're into real estate now. That's wild, man. I'm actually looking at expanding my company into Texas, too. Maybe we should collaborate." I knew that tone. I'd heard it my whole life. The tone of someone pretending to help while waiting to benefit. Still, I agreed to meet. When we met at a business summit in Dallas, he arrived in a designer suit, surrounded by associates who laughed at every word he said. I came alone in a borrowed blazer. He pitched me an idea. His company would partner with mine. But of course, he'd handle the investments, while I'd supervise the dirty work. He called it a win-win. I called it what it was, a modern-day insult dressed in business talk. I politely declined. His smile faded. "Don't take this the wrong way, Mason, but this kind of thing isn't really for guys like you. Real estate's a big league game." That sentence burned. But instead of answering, I shook his hand and walked away. That night, I wrote something in my journal. Never argue with arrogance. Just outgrow it. And that's exactly what I did. Months later, my Texas property finally completed, under budget, ahead of schedule, and stunningly beautiful. Investors who once ignored my calls were now reaching out. A property development firm approached me to co-own a luxury complex in New York City, a skyscraper with high-end apartments and a penthouse overlooking Central Park. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, but there was a twist. One of the silent investors backing the project, Ethan's company, apparently he didn't even know it. His financial manager had invested through a partner firm. When I saw the documents, I almost laughed. Fate had a poetic sense of irony. Still, I played it professionally. I signed on, kept my identity quiet, and became part owner of the building. While Ethan bragged about his company's new Manhattan property, I was the one quietly approving the final blueprints. Behind the scenes, I learned something else. Ethan's company was deep in debt, desperate for a project that could restore their image. They needed this win more than I did. For the first time, the power balance had shifted. But it wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about patience. I knew the moment would come, the moment they'd learn the truth. And when it did, I wanted it to be natural, effortless, no shouting, no revenge speech, just silence and realization. That was the real turning point, not when I gained wealth, but when I gained control of my story. And life, as it turns out, had one last test waiting before the reveal. Because just when I thought everything was finally stable, Ethan invited me to his penthouse party, the same penthouse my signature had sealed ownership on. The night of the party shimmered with the kind of excess that only arrogance could afford. Crystal chandeliers glowed like captured stars, champagne fizzed in crystal glasses, and laughter bounced off marble walls like echoes of vanity. Ethan stood at the center of it all, his hand around a drink, his ego wrapped in designer silk. He was hosting what he called a celebration of legacy. And as fate would have it, the legacy stood right there beside him, me. I wasn't invited as a guest of honor. I was invited as a symbol, the cousin who finally made it back from the struggle, a living reminder of his family generosity. He told the guests, "I'm glad Mason's back. He's done well for himself. Small business, some real estate, nothing like ours, but still, good for him." The words sliced, but I smiled. Because I knew something he didn't. He thought he was hosting me in his penthouse, but the penthouse legally belonged to me. Still, I stayed quiet, letting the night unfold. Sometimes silence tastes sweeter than revenge. A group of his friends surrounded us, champagne in hand. "So, Mason," one said, smirking, "Ethan says you're into construction? You must have picked up a thing or two overseas, huh?" Another chimed in. "Yeah, man, you should thank Ethan. He's really shown the family what success looks like." Their laughter came easy. Too easy. Ethan grinned, enjoying the spotlight. "Hey, don't tease him too hard. He's doing his best. Not everyone gets to this level." He gestured around the glittering penthouse, marble floors, panoramic view, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. I looked out too. The same skyline I once watched from the streets below. Back then, I promised myself I'd rise high enough to see it from the top, not as a guest, but as an owner. And now, I was. A server approached with a silver tray. Ethan raised his glass. "To family and to dreams that came true," he declared. I raised mine too, but quietly. "To the truth," I whispered. A few minutes later, I excused myself and walked toward the living room wall, the one adorned with framed certificates, art, and the penthouse deed itself. Ethan had hung it there like a trophy. He didn't realize he'd hung my victory. I stopped in front of the frame, and that's when his wife noticed. "Oh, that's Ethan's proudest piece," she said cheerfully. "The ownership certificate of this penthouse, signed and sealed 3 years ago." 3 years ago? I repeated softly. "Interesting." I turned the frame slightly enough to catch the embossed gold signature line at the bottom. My name. Mason Cole. Clear as sunlight. For a second, she didn't understand. Then her smile froze. Her eyes darted from the frame to me, then to Ethan. "Ethan." "Honey, this says Mason's name." The room's chatter dimmed. Someone laughed nervously. Ethan turned, still grinning, until he saw it. His face drained of color. That's not, there must be a mistake." I didn't move, didn't speak. I just watched him. He yanked the frame off the wall, flipping it over like he could erase the ink. This can't be right," he muttered. "The real papers are in my office." "Actually," I interrupted quietly, "the real papers are in my office. The property was registered under my name as part of the Manhattan development portfolio." "You remember that? The project your company partially invested in?" Murmurs rippled through the guests. Someone whispered, "Wait, that's his building?" Ethan's jaw locked. You set me up." I shook my head. "No, I just built what you didn't see coming." He laughed bitterly. "You think anyone's going to believe that?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice but letting every word cut clean. "They don't have to believe it, Ethan. They can read it." I turned toward the widescreen TV mounted on the wall. A slideshow was playing of Ethan's company projects until I pressed a button on the remote I'd brought. A new presentation flashed onto the screen. "Property portfolio, Cole Development Holdings." The penthouse address was right there, along with every legal seal and document of ownership. Gasps filled the room. Ethan staggered back, eyes wide, his confidence shattering under the weight of reality. For years, he'd mocked me, called me the struggling cousin, the blue-collar dreamer. Now the truth stood in high definition, framed by his own walls. "I didn't come here to embarrass you," I said softly. "I came because you invited me. But sometimes life brings the truth to the surface all on its own." Ethan tried to speak, but no sound came out. His friends avoided his gaze. His wife looked at him like she was seeing a stranger. I set my glass down and gave him a faint smile. "You always said success is about being seen. I learned it's about what you build when no one's watching." Silence. Complete silence. I turned to leave, but before I did, I looked back one last time. "You were right about one thing, Ethan," I said. "Not everyone gets to this level," and then I walked out. No applause. No revenge speech. Just the sound of the door closing behind me, and the faint echo of everything he thought he owned crumbling inside his pride. That was the night the balance shifted. The night I stopped being the cousin who came back from nothing and became the man who built everything they once said I couldn't. Dear audience, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps. The silence that filled the penthouse that night was worth every sleepless year Ethan had endured. The cousin who once laughed at his worn-out shoes now stood frozen, eyes wide, pride shattered. For years they thought Ethan had returned a failure, a man who couldn't survive in the big city. But truth has a strange rhythm. It arrives slowly, then hits all at once. And that night, in the penthouse overlooking Manhattan's skyline, it arrived like a storm. After the truth was out that the entire building was registered under Ethan's name, no one dared to meet his eyes. His cousin Mark tried to fake a smile, but guilt had already written itself across his face. The same cousin who once mocked him for renting a small room now stood in the luxury suite that Ethan himself had designed, funded and quietly owned through his company. It wasn't revenge that satisfied Ethan, it was peace. For the first time in years, he felt weightless. The days that followed brought a different kind of fame. News outlets picked up the story of the unknown owner. Social media loved it. A man mocked by his family turned out to be the silent force behind a skyline symbol of wealth. But Ethan didn't chase interviews or camera lights. He stayed the same, modest, focused. He spent his mornings mentoring young architects from underprivileged backgrounds, the same way he once struggled without guidance. He funded scholarships for students from small towns who dreamed big but feared bigger. His cousin, on the other hand, disappeared from the spotlight. Mark sold his fancy cars, moved into a smaller apartment, and avoided family gatherings for months. Yet Ethan didn't hold grudges. When Mark finally called, his voice trembling with regret, Ethan answered simply, "Family isn't about who wins, it's about who learns." He invited him for dinner. No cameras, no audience. Just two men, once divided by ego, sharing silence that felt healing. Years later, Ethan stood on the same balcony where he was once laughed at. The skyline had changed, but one thing hadn't: his gratitude. He had learned that success means little if you can't carry grace with it. He never bragged, never posted his wealth online. He let his kindness speak. His company grew not because he was rich, but because he stayed real. And every time a struggling young dreamer came to him saying, "They said I'd never make it," Ethan smiled softly and replied, "They said that about me, too." When he finally bought his parents a home back in his old town, the same neighbors who once whispered about his failure came to congratulate him. His mother's eyes welled with tears when she walked through the marble-floored entrance. "This is your victory," she said. Ethan shook his head gently. "No, Mom, it's our redemption." Now, whenever he visits that penthouse, the one that once witnessed humiliation, he sits quietly near the window, watching the city glow below. He doesn't feel anger anymore, just gratitude. Gratitude for every rejection that built his resilience, for every mockery that sharpened his silence, for every heartbreak that taught him humility. He once thought success was about proving others wrong. Now he knows. It's about proving yourself right. So the next time someone mocks your journey, remember Ethan. Because sometimes life lets people laugh first, so they'll listen later. Thanks for watching, story lovers. If you felt inspired by Ethan's journey, drop a 8 in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Your city, your story, your journey, it all matters here. Subscribe for more powerful stories every week.